Greetings, my name is Egon Chalakian. The 8.8 magnitude earthquake in Kamchatka shook the world on July 30th, 2025. It was one of the most powerful in recent decades. But if you believe this was the end of this particular chapter, you are vastly mistaken. The Kamchatka earthquake is merely the beginning of a new phase of escalating catastrophes. And this is precisely what we warned about. The strength and frequency of earthquakes will continue to rise because the planet has entered a phase of large-scale geodynamic transformation. In this video address, I will explain why the 8.8 mega earthquake occurred in Kamchatka, its true cause, and most importantly, why this event is only one element of a far more dangerous process already unfolding across the entire globe. The illusion of safety is the most dangerous self-deception of our time. A resident of Los Angeles, Istanbul, or Tokyo reading the news about Kamchatka might have thought, that's far away, that doesn't concern me, but that is a delusion. What happened in Kamchatka is not an isolated incident. It is a symptom. It is a clear and unmistakable signal that the global geodynamic system of our planet has entered a stage of active, catastrophic breakdown. Beneath the apparent chaos of natural disasters lies a strict regularity. The Kamchatka earthquake was no accident. It was a direct consequence of processes that began decades ago. Processes we have warned you about many times over. In today's address, I will present irrefutable evidence that ALLATRA repeatedly warned of the high likelihood of such events. The mechanism behind this earthquake is tied to processes the Russian Academy of Sciences prefers not to disclose. Why remain silent? Because acknowledging the true causes would require a fundamental revision of current scientific models of geophysical processes and the integration of new interdisciplinary approaches. It would also necessitate a reevaluation of the academic and professional standing of those who loudly insist that nothing unusual is happening and that the situation is under control. And to admit that genuine public and national safety demands serious financial investment would mean reshuffling spheres of influence, territories already comfortably divided among those who have secured their comfort zones and lined their pockets at the people's expense. They are unwilling to relinquish their cushy seats and well-stuffed wallets, so it is far easier to suppress the truth and persecute those who, out of concern for public safety, dare to sound the alarm about the looming threat. This is precisely why ALLATRA was declared an extremist organization in Russia in June of 2025. And this is why a law was passed in Russia prohibiting even the search for materials labeled as extremist. All of this was done for one reason only, so that you, dear friends, would never learn the true causes of the unfolding catastrophes, which will only continue to intensify. Let me repeat the central idea I want you to fully grasp. The Kamchatka earthquake is not the end. It is only the beginning. Today, I will discuss what lies behind the polished language of official statements, how to recognize the approaching threat, and what you can do to protect yourself and your loved ones. Because the next catastrophe may strike where it is least expected. On July 30th, 2025, a magnitude 8.8 earthquake struck Kamchatka, one of the strongest seismic events in modern history. It was the most powerful earthquake to hit Kamchatka since 1952. The epicenter was located approximately 150 to 160 kilometers, about 95 to 100 miles east of the Russian city of Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, at a depth ranging from 17 to 32 kilometers, according to various reports. The earthquake generated tsunami waves that reached Japan, Hawaii, and the western coast of the United States. In Russia, localized flooding occurred, and evacuations were carried out in Severodvinsk and the coastal areas of Kamchatka. In the city of Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, the tremors reached at least intensity of magnitude 6, damaging several structures, including a kindergarten and a clinic. Injuries among the populations were reported. Following the 8.8 magnitude earthquake off Kamchatka's coast, a wave of aftershocks was recorded, many of which were felt in populated areas of the region. Within just a few hours, at least 5 strong aftershocks were registered with magnitudes ranging from 4.8 to 6.0. Again, the most powerful magnitude being 6.0. Over the course of the day, the total number of aftershocks of magnitude 3.0 or higher exceeded 170, with 8 of those exceeding magnitude 6.0. According to specialists, a powerful aftershock sequence is underway, with additional tremors of up to magnitude 7.5 expected within the next month. In today's address, I will comment on our own forecast. This is not just another routine seismic event in the Pacific Ring of Fire. To understand what makes this earthquake different, and why it is so alarming, we must first examine its underlying causes. Let us begin by reviewing how Russian scientists are commenting on, explaining, or attempting to explain this earthquake. Then we will analyze why their interpretations reveal scientific inconsistency and rely on speculative assumptions that do not withstand critical scrutiny of the actual data. The director of the Unified Geophysical Service of the Russian Academy of Sciences, Mr. Yuri Vinogradov, whose qualifications I have analyzed in a separate video, was quick to comment on the event. And indeed, something similar occurred in 1952, when the even more powerful North Kuril earthquake of magnitude 9.0 struck. However, what Vinogradov either failed to mention or simply did not know is that the trigger mechanisms behind these two events, what occurred in 1952 and what happened now, are fundamentally different. And you will soon understand why. Mr. Vinogradov claims that seismologists had been anticipating a major earthquake in Kamchatka since 2004, and that a magnitude 6.0 event occurred in July 20, just 10 days before the disaster, which many scientists believe had released the built-up tension in the Kuril-Kamchatka zone. Here, special attention must be paid to Mr. Vinogradov's subtle rhetoric. He appears to shift responsibility by suggesting that it was others who believed that the July magnitude 6.0 quake had sufficiently discharged the region's stress. And I quote, "Well, that's it. Another major earthquake has occurred. The tension has been released, and nothing else like this will happen for at least another 10 years, end quote. Formally, he distances himself from the claim, barely offering a personal position. Yet it is precisely his commentary that shapes the misleading perception, both in the public and among scientists, that the problem has already been resolved. So Mr. Vinogradov's actual expertise lies not so much in direct statements, but instead in the artful propagation of a reassuring narrative. And the result speaks for itself. Not even 10 days later, on July 30th, 2025, all leading seismic centers around the world recorded a devastating earthquake of the magnitude 8.7 to 8.8 in Kamchatka. This event not only disproved the forecast of certain optimists, but also once again demonstrated that such reassuring rhetoric is dangerous and fundamentally misleads the public. Nature delivered a surprise, as Mr. Vinogradov puts it. Yet behind this so-called surprise lies not mere chance, but a systematic process. What Vinogradov refers to as accumulated stress has a much more profound and far-reaching cause. This is not simply stress building up between two tectonic plates. This is stress driven by the pressure of the colossal Siberian magma plume against the entire Siberian lithospheric plate. The enormous Siberian magma plume, a rising stream of superheated material from deep within the Earth, is actively exerting pressure on the lithosphere of Siberia. The head of this plume, measuring 1,200 to 1,500 kilometers, about 745 to 930 miles in diameter, is located just south of the Gidan and Taimyr peninsulas. The zone of magmatic flow dispersion spans up to 2,500 to 3,000 kilometers, roughly 1,550 to 1,860 miles, an area comparable in size to that of the entire continent of Australia. This colossal phenomenon affects not only the heart of Siberia. How could the pressure from a massive magma plume in the center of Eurasia lead to an earthquake thousands of kilometers away on its Pacific rim? The mechanism is simple and as explainable as the laws of physics. I would describe it as a hydraulic piston effect. Imagine the Siberian plume as a piston, pressing upward with tremendous force against the lithosphere. But the Siberian platform is an ancient, rigid, and monolithic structure. It does not bend or fracture in the middle. Instead, like a solid piece of armor, it transmits this immense stress across the entire Eurasian plate towards its outer edges. It is precisely at those edges where the plate collides with others that this stress becomes concentrated. We call this the edge effects of the plate. The magnitude 8.8 earthquake that struck Kamchatka represents a textbook example of an edge effect. The Siberian magma plume exerts pressure across the entire lithospheric plate, but it does not simply push it upward. The mechanism is far more intriguing. The plume gradually erodes the lithosphere from below, as if wearing it down, and softens the underlying asthenosphere. It is crucial to understand that the influence of the plume does not result in sharp, localized deformations of the Earth's crust at a single point. What we are observing is not catastrophic surface uplift, but rather a subtle, widespread elevation of the entire Siberian crustal block, a region that encompasses the West Siberian Plate, the East Siberian Craton, and the Verkhoyansk-Chukotka fold belt. It is precisely this large-scale, relatively slow process that generates immense stress along the edges of the continental block. But why do the most pronounced geodynamic processes occur specifically at the edges of this vast block? The answer lies in the way the plume intrudes. It softens the underlying asthenosphere. Picture a dense, monolithic structure beginning to experience pressure from below, not uniformly, but in distinct pulsations. Even a slight uplift in such a plate results in the greatest deformation at its periphery. Its outer edges begin to quite literally rock. Seismic data analysis from 1990 to 2024 clearly reveals spikes in seismic activity along the perimeter of this block. Across the Urals, the Baikal region, the Verkhoyansk fold belt, and most notably in Kamchatka. This activity occurs in wave-like pulsating bursts across different regions, resembling a gradual rocking of the plate from the west to east and from the north to south. It is precisely along the edges of this colossal block that the most dramatic geodynamic processes are unfolding, such as in Kamchatka, which lies at the very margin of the continental crustal block, now under pressure from the plume. Kamchatka is also part of the Pacific Ring of Fire. Seismic data from 1990 to 2024 show that the Kamchatka and Kuril Islands region is not only experiencing the gradual trend of increasing seismic activity seen throughout the Ring of Fire, there are also distinct independent spikes in activity. This indicates that the Siberian plume exerts its own direct influence on the Kamchatka region as the terminal edge of the continental crustal block subjected to its pressure. Particularly telling are the changes in earthquake depth. In the Kuril-Kamchatka region, anomalies in the distribution of earthquake depths point to increased mobility at the lithospheric plate junction, another direct consequence of the Siberian plume's influence. The Kamchatka earthquake on July 30th is a direct result of this process. The irony lies in the fact that the magnitude 6.0 earthquake on July 20th, cited by Beregradov, did not relieve the accumulated stress, as some scientists believed, but instead served as a precursor to a far more powerful event. So what actually happened? In truth, we are witnessing a classical manifestation of the pulsating nature of plume intrusion in which seismic activity predictably intensifies around the perimeter of the affected zone, culminating in the plume's eventual surface breakthrough. The observed sequence of events is no coincidence. It is a predictable outcome of a global geodynamic process. The Siberian magma plume is gradually rocking the continental plate, generating pulsating spikes of seismic activity along its edges, including Kamchatka. We are, in effect, observing this process unfold in real time, and by its very nature, it is sure to lead to events of far greater catastrophic magnitude. If no decisive action is taken in the coming years to relieve the pressure within the magma plume of Siberia through controlled degassing measures, then it can be stated with a high degree of certainty that within 5 years, earthquakes on the scale of the Kamchatka event, magnitude 8.8, will be occurring around the world at an average frequency of 1 per week. Against this backdrop, Vinogradov's musings about some supposed reprieve from nature about how the macroseismic effects turned out to be milder than expected for such a magnitude sound especially telling. But unfortunately, I must disappoint both the so-called expert and all Russian citizens. There will be no more reprieves. This does not mean that each subsequent earthquake in Kamchatka will be stronger than the last. However, the overall trend is unmistakable. Seismic and volcanic activity in the region will only continue to escalate. Expecting that it happened once in 70 years, so now we can live in peace, as Vinogradov suggests, is at best naive. Strong earthquakes will continue in Kamchatka, and volcanic activity will only intensify. For example, following the July 30th earthquake, increased activity was recorded in Kamchatka's Kluchevskaya Sopka volcano. Moreover, the nature of volcanic eruptions is also about to change. Magma will increasingly emerge from deeper magma chambers, resulting in a sharp increase in eruption power and destructive potential. It is true that once the Kuril-Kamchatka margin of the plate rises significantly, volcanic activity may temporarily cease. But if that stage is reached, neither you nor I will be alive to witness it. Why? Because to reach such a state, the geodynamic and magmatic processes would have to escalate to such an extreme that humanity, by that point, would already have perished, wiped out by a cascade of mega eruptions, devastating earthquakes, and giant tsunami waves. I would also like to note that my esteemed colleague, Mr. Danilov, informed the Alatra scientific community in early June that he was working on a new experimental method for calculating the probabilities of major tectonic events. According to his preliminary calculations, a high-magnitude seismic event, 8.0 through 9.0, could occur between July 3rd and July 15th, 2025, in the vicinity of Japan, primarily in the Tokara Islands region. Mr. Danilov emphasized that this forecasting method remains under development and testing and does not yet possess verified accuracy, primarily due to the lack of comprehensive geodynamic data, particularly regarding the state of the Siberian plume. Nevertheless, based on the data available at the time, Mr. Danilov proposed the hypothesis that a strong earthquake could occur during that period in Japan's southern seismic zone. His forecast also included the note that if the event did not occur by July 15th in the southern part of the region, it would most likely shift along the edge of the lithospheric plate to the north, with a probable occurrence window extending into early August. Subsequent events confirmed Mr. Danilov's forecast. Since July 3rd, Mr. Danilov had predicted seismic activity in the Tokara Islands region has increased significantly, with numerous earthquakes of magnitude 5 and above, but no major earthquake has occurred. However, on July 30th, an earthquake with a magnitude of 8.7 to 8.8 was recorded in the Kamchatka region, closer to the northern part of the Japanese archipelago, near the Kuril Arc, which incidentally historically belonged to Japan. Despite the high degree of uncertainty and limited availability of initial data, Mr. Danilov's calculation may be considered successful and accurate. At this point, I would like to emphasize which factors are not the causes of this earthquake. It is essential to understand this clearly so we do not continue wasting time attempting to forecast future events based on irrelevant variables. I will also highlight which causes must be prioritized because they will determine the future of humanity itself. I will demonstrate that Alatra warned about this event, just as it has warned of many others still to come. Members of Russia's academic community have proposed various alternative hypotheses to explain the Kamchatka disaster. The most popular of these is the supposed influence of solar activity. This theory is not merely incorrect. It is scientifically unfounded. For example, Elena Kobeleva, director of the Baikal branch of the Unified Geophysical Service of the Russian Academy of Sciences, made a statement regarding a possible connection between the Kamchatka earthquake and solar activity. This is a textbook case of flawed casual reasoning that cannot withstand serious scientific scrutiny. Kobeleva asserts, quote, "We're seeing increased activity with earthquakes, Turkey, Myanmar, and now Kamchatka. I agree with many of my colleagues who associate this with rising solar activity," end quote. However, this statement contains several fundamental misconceptions. First of all, as recently as June 11, 2025, the press offices of the Solar Astronomy Laboratory of the Space Research Institute and the Institute of Solar Terrestrial Physics, both part of the same Russian Academy of Sciences, announced that the peak of solar cycle 25 had already passed. In other words, solar activity is now in decline. Yet, Elena Kobeleva, director of the Baikal branch of the Unified Geophysical Service, either was unaware of this or chose to disregard the conclusions of her own colleagues. Thus, in commenting on the July 30th Kamchatka earthquake, she confidently cited increasing solar activity as a possible cause of the disaster. So here we have the same Academy of Sciences, a difference of 6 weeks, and two diametrically opposed statements. On the one hand, activity is declining, and on the other, activity is increasing. One might say the equation has an infinite number of solutions, so long as one isn't constrained by the laws of logic. I am continually astonished at how the Russian scientific community approaches its own reasoning in the classic, all too familiar Russian style of, close enough. One day it's rising, the next it's falling, as long as it sounds impressive and doesn't invite any probing questions. And so, when faced with a magnitude 8.8 catastrophe, the temptation must be too great to resist simply pointing a finger at the sky, literally, and naming the sun as the prime suspect. I must say, I'm rather surprised that Raysears, led by Dvorkin, Russia's top expert on extremism, has not yet declared the sun an extremist. Perhaps that's because another division of the very same Russian Academy of Sciences has already cleared the suspect for lack of activity. And frankly, I find it refreshing that anyone, has been acquitted in Russia. Now, some individuals may try to defend these contradictions in the Academy's position by pointing to the fragmentation of its scientific institutions, arguing that one department simply isn't aware of another's findings. But that explanation raises even more troubling question. Suppose the scientific community cannot manage the most basic exchange of data on such a fundamental parameter as solar activity. What are the chances that this same community will be capable of responding adequately to severe geophysical threats? Against the backdrop of such a striking example of fragmented and quite frankly weak methodology demonstrated by several representatives of the Russian academic community, it is especially ironic that these are the very experts entrusted today with the role of public mouthpieces. It is they who shape the public discourse, persuading millions that everything is under control. There is no cause for concern, and this is how it's always been. Their opinions, often delivered without deep analysis, without systematic verification, and frequently without the slightest interdisciplinary review, are presented to the public as unquestionable truth. They speak from media platforms, instilling a false sense of security, substituting scientific competence with rhetorical reassurance. Meanwhile, scientific conclusions based on interdisciplinary analysis, comprehensive systems thinking, and verified models are deliberately discredited and silenced. This applies above all to the scientists, experts, and volunteers of the Alatra International Public Movement, who consistently and rigorously warn of the escalating climate and geodynamic crisis, grounding their statements in concrete data. We speak of rising seismic activity, of the threats posed by the Siberian magma plume, of real risk to lives of millions. And it is precisely for this that Alatra has been repressed in Russia and forced into exile, while the truth we voice is deliberately distorted or ignored, simply to ensure it is never heard. It leaves one with the distinct impression that the strategy is as follows: amplify the voices of those who will lull the public into complacency and cut the microphone for those who emphasize the urgency of immediate action. However, a logical question arises. How viable is such a strategy in the first place? How long can it mask the mounting danger? Did it prevent the earthquakes that have already occurred? Did it protect anyone? I believe the mega earthquake in Kamchatka provides a compelling answer to that question. This earthquake is a direct and unmistakable signal from the planet itself. Seismic activity is intensifying, and at the epicenter of this process is the Siberian magma plume. It is becoming more active, setting new tectonic realities, and it is doing so with increasing force. Moreover, I will state plainly, this will not be the last catastrophic event to strike Russia this year. One can continue for a little while longer to pretend that everything is going according to plan. One can persist in reassuring the public and concealing the real mechanisms behind what is happening. But the scale of the changes ahead is so grand that even the most comfortable strategies of silence will soon fail. Because when the ground itself begins to shake beneath your feet, no statement from Vinogradov or declarations from any other so-called heavyweights of the Russian Academy of Sciences will be of any help. Now let us return once more to the question of solar activity, their favorite explanation for everything they cannot explain. Could it have been the cause of Kamchatka's earthquake on July 30th? Second argument against the solar hypothesis. The current 25th solar cycle is not particularly strong. In fact, we are observing a period of relatively moderate solar activity. Just look at the charts. Many previous cycles were significantly more intense, yet they were not accompanied by similar spikes in seismic activity. If there were a direct correlation between solar and seismic activity, we would expect to see much stronger earthquakes during the peaks of these solar cycles, which, as you can clearly see from this chart, has not occurred. Third, we are witnessing an exponential rise in seismic activity in recent decades, which does not correlate with the solar cycles at all. Solar cycles follow a roughly 11-year rhythm, whereas seismic activity is steadily increasing regardless of which phase the solar cycle is in. Fourth, and this is especially important, there was no anomalous solar activity observed either in the days leading up to or during the week of the Kamchatka earthquake. Nothing of the kind that could have triggered an event of such magnitude. If there were a direct mechanism linking solar flares to seismic processes, we would expect to see a clear temporal correlation between the two phenomena. Indeed, there are studies that suggest a statistical association between solar activity and earthquakes, but these correlations are weak and cannot account for catastrophic events like the Kamchatka earthquake. Moreover, such studies often suffer from methodological flaws and selective data sampling. The Kamchatka earthquake was not the result of solar flares. It was a predictable manifestation of edge effects caused by the influence of the Siberian plume on the lithosphere. When an enormous lithospheric plate is subjected to pressure from below and begins to rise, massive stress accumulates at its edges, precisely where Kamchatka is located. That stress is released in the form of powerful earthquakes. Attempting to link a catastrophic earthquake to solar activity reflects an overly simplistic view, one that ignores the actual geodynamic processes unfolding deep within the Earth. Such an approach merely distracts from the real causes and mechanisms of seismic activity, which can have serious consequences for forecasting future events and for developing effective strategies to mitigate their impact. So what happens when, instead of objective action, we witness inaction? First comes the phase of nothing serious, followed by the phase of it's already too late to act. In such a scenario, the critical window for calmly and rationally implementing necessary measures never arrives. When we spoke about climate change and its connection to geodynamic processes, efforts to discredit us began, ranging from public ridicule to accusations of pseudoscience. We were dismissed, labeled questionable experts. But now I must ask, whom should people believe? Mr. Vinogradov? Or perhaps the experts who insisted that such powerful earthquakes were impossible in this region? The irony of the situation is staggering. In Russia, we were declared extremists for trying to warn about an approaching catastrophe. You claim we rely on dubious scientists. Then tell me, who are your so-called super scientists? The ones who can't even agree among themselves on whether solar activity is rising or falling? The ones who, for the past 2 years, have ignored the mounting signs of an unfolding geodynamic disaster? Now I ask you, was it ever justified to brand us as extremists when you yourselves will soon come to us for help? And I guarantee that you will. You will come. You will have no choice. Life will force you to, and so will the events unfolding across Russian territory. You know perfectly well that no Vinogradov, nor anyone like him, will ever be capable under any circumstances of solving the problems you now face as a direct result of Dvorkin and his entire pseudo-religious clique, who drove Alatra out. You will be forced to reach out, because if nothing is done, then in just 5 years, what happened in Kamchatka will be happening all over the world, and not once every 50 years, but at least once a week. We reached out to reason in Russia countless times, but reason was never found. Instead of being heard, we were unjustly punished. And now all the threats we warned about are unfolding and will only continue to escalate. So let me remind you what we said about Kamchatka and the rise in seismic activity in that region. The conclusions you draw are up to you. From the Alatra report on the threat of magma plume eruption, and I quote, "Remarkably, the depth of earthquakes in the Kuril-Kamchatka region is also increasing. This indicates that the interaction between the lithospheric plates is becoming more dynamic due to the influence of the Siberian mantle plume. An increase in volcanic activity in the Kuril-Kamchatka region is expected, along with the emergence of anomalies in the rapid ascent of deep magma. An analysis of seismic data in the Kamchatka and Kuril Islands region shows a noticeable increase in the magnitude 4.0 plus earthquakes. The region is part of the Pacific Ring of Fire. However, most seismicity spikes are independent. This may indicate that the Siberian plume exerts its own influence on the Kamchatka and Kuril Islands region. Humanity is entering a new phase of heightened seismic activity. This is the era of catastrophic earthquakes, events we can regrettably no longer avert. Previously, major seismic events were isolated. Today, however, we are witnessing a clearly defined trend of exponential growth. Preliminary estimates indicate that the area affected by magma flows beneath Siberia may span 2,500 to 3,000 kilometers in diameter, an expanse comparable in size to the Australian continent. At this moment, the magma plume is in a critical stage. It has already begun to uplift the tectonic plate above it, evidenced by increased seismic activity along its margins. This points to the possibility that the magma plume could breach the surface at any time. This will happen both in the region of the rising magma plume and along edges of the lithospheric blocks of the Earth's crust, where the plume is exerting increasing pressure. We will not witness significant tectonic shifts until the moment the Siberian platform ruptures. Some precursor earthquakes may occur along the edges of the plate, but when strong quakes begin directly above the plume, it will mean that only minutes, at most a few hours, remain before a catastrophic event. Any competent scientist will confirm these conclusions. We have not yet entered a period of sharply heightened seismic activity characterized by numerous earthquakes with magnitudes of 8 and above, or regions facing the consequences of mega earthquakes. However, we still have a window of time. Building foundations must be engineered to withstand earthquakes of magnitude 8 and above, even in regions where such events are not currently occurring. This video demonstrates that both the information presented in my video statements and the data published in Alatra's reports form a coherent and scientifically grounded model, explaining the causes of the Kamchatka earthquake. Moreover, this model shows that the event was not an isolated incident, but a troubling indicator of the rapidly worsening geodynamic situation. And now, let me speak plainly for the fools in the room. Try to think. If our model proved accurate for Kamchatka, what does that tell you, including the forecasts we've made for other regions of the world? The question is no longer if those forecasts will come true. The question is when they will, and whether you will be prepared next time. Perhaps even more important is this question. Will there be anyone left to prepare for and respond to these events? This is especially true considering that Russia today is a principal contributor to the planet's global climate crisis, and that it is precisely in Russia that the experts and organizations raising critical questions about the real geodynamic and systemic causes are being systematically and aggressively pushed out. Naturally, I return here to the persecution campaign unleashed against the Alatra International Public Movement, carried out in Russia in the most inhumane and brutal way. A full 10 years ago, Alatra attempted to present scientifically verified information, drawn from a confidential report, concerning the activation of the Siberian magma plume and the exponential rise in global seismic activity. The response was a discrediting campaign orchestrated by raciers against the movement's participants and the information they were trying to communicate. After Alatra participants began publicly addressing this topic in 2021, bringing it into the open information space, publishing reports containing specific warnings about the mechanism of the impending catastrophe, particularly the influence of the Siberian magma plume and the inevitable rise in seismic activity along the perimeter of the Eurasian plate, those findings were not merely ignored. They were met with the harshest repression directed against Alatra and its volunteers. Let me remind you, in August 2023, Alatra's activities in Russia were first declared undesirable, and by June 2025, labeled extremist. In other words, the very people being driven out of the country are those who understand what is happening, who know where to truly search for root causes of the climate and geodynamic threats unfolding in Russia and across the world. And most importantly, they are expelling those who know how to solve these threats and how to actually stabilize the climate. You expelled Alatra. And now what? Has anything improved? Be honest. Has the seismic threat vanished from the country? Did it disappear along with those who tried to warn you about it? The results are, quite literally, plain for all to see. The events now unfolding align precisely with the scientific model developed by the specialists of the Alatra International Public Movement. According to this model, presented in Alatra's reports and repeatedly referenced in my public statements, the planet has entered a phase of exponential growth in seismic activity. This model specifically predicts an increased likelihood of major earthquakes in edge zones along the perimeter of the Siberian magma plume, an area subjected to heightened tectonic stress due to deep magmatic processes. These confirmed and alarming trends manifested most notably on July 30th, 2025, in the form of the Kamchatka mega-earthquake, magnitude 8.8. And now, as it turns out, those who were analyzing actual geodynamic processes were correct, not those still clinging to sunspots as a catch-all explanation for everything happening on Earth. That leaves us with just one question. Can it be considered rational to expel from the scientific and public sphere an organization that provides verified, scientifically grounded forecasts and is internationally recognized for doing so? Alatra is an independent volunteer movement that unites specialists from various countries and not only conducts large-scale research in geodynamics, climate, ecology, and systemic natural processes, but also consistently operates within the framework of international scientific cooperation. Yet it appears that this particular combination, evidence-based analysis, international recognition, and inconvenient conclusions, has become especially aggravating to certain Russian institutions. The Alatra scientific community brings a unique interdisciplinary approach to the study of natural disasters and systemic risk, aiming to address shared existential threats. While former movement participants face repression and silencing of their work in Russia, Alatra volunteers, contrariwise, continue to receive support and recognition on the international stage. In 2024, the Alatra movement received the apostolic blessing from His Holiness Pope Francis. In 2025, Pope Leo XIV issued a second blessing, addressed to the movement's president and all its volunteers. At international UN climate forums, including COP16 and COP29, Alatra representatives delivered reports, presented scientific strategies for confronting climate instability, shared innovative solutions, and strengthened global collaboration. This is transparent, evidence-based, results-driven work. And here is where the true irony reveals itself. Those with scientific expertise, internationally recognized methodologies, and real tools for understanding what is happening, those who are the very people being removed from public view in Russia, and these same forces are now attempting to shut down Alatra in the Ukraine and silence its voice in the democratic world. Meanwhile, the spotlight remains fixed on those who can loudly and convincingly declare that everything is under control. This is what their response looks like. A string of reassuring words that seem convincing only to those unaccustomed to verifying their resources. No comprehensive analysis, no understanding of systemic risk, just emotion, and most critically, no answer to the fundamental question, what must be done to prevent this from happening again? Only confident-sounding faces, bold declarations, and a complete absence of concrete solutions. As a result, instead of objective assessment, what follows is academic paralysis. The release of energy in Kamchatka is not a discharge. It is merely a temporary release of pressure through one valve. The system as a whole continues to accumulate tension. This means that Kamchatka is not the end. It is the beginning of a new, far more intense and brutal phase of geodynamic transformation. The next points of tension release, located in other weak zones along the edges of lithospheric plates, are inevitable. Yellowstone, the San Andreas Fault, the Campi Flegrei caldera, the Japan Trench. These are not just names on a map. They are loaded guns, and the pressure on their triggers is increasing with each passing day. The primary threat we have also warned about, the threat of magma breaking through to the surface in Siberia, at the pressure center, is no longer hypothetical. It is becoming increasingly real. The consequences of such an event would not be regional but planetary. They would put at stake the very survival of humanity as a species. Today we stand at a bifurcation point, at a crossroads where the fate of our civilization is being decided. One path is denial, disunity, and the willful disregard of facts in the name of political calm and economic gain. It is the path humanity has followed under the guidance of fools up until now, and it leads directly into the abyss, to the guaranteed collapse of global civilization under the weight of synchronized, escalating disasters around the world. The other path is the path of elevated intelligence, the path of accepting inconvenient truth, the path of immediate, coordinated action. We can no longer afford the luxury of decades-long academic debates behind closed doors while the world outside collapses. Science has already rendered its verdict. The next move belongs to humanity. Remember this: life is worth fighting for.